Hi everyone, Dave Sugden of Evidence at Trial. Today we are going to talk about the secondary evidence rule, a rule super important for business litigators in California. The first question is, how did we get here? In law school, we learned about the best evidence rule, and what that rule required, what that rule said, was that to prove the content of a writing, you had to provide the original. But with discovery getting bigger and bigger and the advent of technology like the Xerox machine and fax machine in the 1990s, there ended up being so many exceptions to the rule that the rule itself almost became obsolete. And so in 1999, the California legislature created the secondary evidence rule. We see that in the California Evidence Code, section 1520 through section 1523. So what does this rule say? In essence, what it says is secondary evidence is generally admissible. And so, for example, with the best evidence rule, the rule was that secondary evidence was generally inadmissible. Now we have a general rule of admissibility. And so secondary evidence to prove the content of a writing is generally admissible unless there's a genuine dispute over the actual material terms of the original document, and justice requires its exclusion, or the court decides it would just simply be unfair. So first, let's stop and understand, what is secondary evidence? A lot of lawyers think, oh, that means a copy of the original. No, it's much broader than that. Secondary evidence is defined in case law as anything other than the original to prove the content of a writing. And that becomes super important because a lot of times in business cases, you'll have a huge stack of documents. And we think, do I have to admit all of them into evidence? Let's say, for example, you have a case with hundreds of transactions, hundreds of invoices, and it's a collection case. Do you have to admit a copy of every single invoice, or is there an easier way? There is with the secondary evidence rule. You can create a document, and that document becomes secondary evidence of the original that summarizes what the documents say. And so, for example, if there's hundreds of transactions and it all adds up to $1 million, you can create a document that breaks down the invoices, shows the number, shows the total, and asks that to be admitted. Will it be? Well, again, we have a general rule of inclusion, of admissibility, unless there's a genuine dispute over the documents and justice requires its exclusion, or the court seems to think it's unfair. How do we make sure it's fair? Well, we provide the actual invoices or copies of the invoices to the other side. Therefore, when it comes to admitting the secondary piece, the summary document, what you can do is explain that they've received everything. They can now cross-examine any witness about it using the underlying documents. It makes it much simpler than having to admit a big stack of documents. What about oral testimony? Oral testimony is treated differently, and we see that in section 1523. And oral testimony has a general rule of inadmissibility. And so to illustrate, in section 1521, that talks about secondary evidence being generally admissible. It has a carve-out in subdivision C where it says that oral testimony, look at section 1523. Let's do that now. With oral testimony, again, courts want to know, is evidence trustworthy? And it's inherently suspect when there's a written document and someone is, instead of providing a copy or a summary, attesting to its contents. And that's why you have a general rule of inadmissibility with exceptions. The exceptions are if a copy is lost or destroyed without fraudulent intent on the proponent of the evidence, which makes perfect sense. In other words, you can't be the one that destroyed the document on purpose with a fraudulent intent and then be allowed to, in court, say, let me tell you what this document just said. For obvious reasons, not allowed. The other exception is if the proponent of the oral testimony doesn't have possession and can't reasonably get it without either the loss of a lot of time or other inconvenient factors. In other words, it's too hard to get. The other component with this not being in possession and not being able to reasonably get it is that it can't be so close to the controlling issues of the case. In other words, the more important this document is, the more effort the court's going to want to see the proponent go to get it before allowing oral testimony. The third exception, super important, and that is oral testimony is allowed if the writing involves numerous accounts or writings, and there'd be a great loss of time to introduce all of them, and the testimony is the general result of the whole. And so, for example, going back to our invoice example, a person can provide oral testimony on the whole summary of numerous, for example, invoices. Again, it's subject to section 1521, where the court may exclude it if it's unfair. So how do you make it fair? Make sure they have the actual invoices. But so long as they've been provided, a witness can attest, provide oral testimony, and explain it would take too long to go through all of them, but the total is X amount. And under section 1523, that evidence should be admitted. So that, in a nutshell, is the secondary evidence rule. I hope this was helpful. Please download, rate, review, subscribe to the YouTube channel for Evidence at Trial. And if you want to do a really deep dive on these rules, how to apply them and learn how to use these rules as weapons, visit evidenceattrial.com and look at our on-demand courses. Thanks for watching.